The U.S. Arab Radio Network is proud to offer the Ray Hanania Show with veteran journalist Ray Hanania, the U.S. correspondent for the Arab News newspaper. U.S. Arab Radio broadcasts content Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. on WNZK AM 690 in Detroit, WDMV 700 in Washington, D.C., and simulcast through stations around the country. Programs will rerun from 5 till 6 p.m. Visit us on Facebook at U.S. Arab Radio. And we're also streaming live on Facebook.com/Arab News.
And now we're on the line with Jason Greenblatt, the former White House envoy to the Middle East under former President Donald Trump, and the author of the recent published book, In the Path of Abraham, at www.inthepathofabraham.com. Jason, thank you so much for joining us on the radio show.
Thank you for having me at this dark and gloomy time.
I know this is kind of all very controversial, but you were very involved in the peace plan during the Trump administration and a man with much experience in this conflict. Who do you blame for the recent escalation?
One of the things that we discovered when we worked on the peace plan was Hamas was really one of the major blockers to potential peace between Israel and the Palestinians. You know, you and I don't agree on many of the issues, and we could discuss them at length. Jerusalem, what I don't like to refer to, but what you would refer to as refugees, I call Judea Samaria, you would call occupied Palestinian territory. I get that, and we could spend weeks, if not months, talking about it.
Sure.
But our view very much was, unless and until we could uproot Hamas and let the Palestinian people have proper leadership that wants a better future and doesn't want to destroy Israel, there's really not much to discuss. So I would say that, you know, as difficult as the lives of the Palestinians have been, the 2+ million Palestinians under Gaza, their lives are miserable because of Hamas first and foremost. Could things be different if Israel didn't have to blockade or Egypt didn't have to blockade? Again, we could talk about all that. There's so many nuances there. But the primary source of the misery of Palestinians and the attacks on Israel is Hamas.
And and in terms of this recent flare-up, this violence that we saw, what provoked it? I mean, was there something that provoked it, or what, in your perspective, who do you blame for this?
Well, in my view, the Iranian regime is behind all of this. They're not just behind Hamas, they're behind Hezbollah, they're behind the Houthis. Of course, you have ISIS. All of these terror groups are enemies not just of Israel, they're enemies of America, they're enemies of our friends and allies throughout the Middle East, our Gulf friends and allies, Jordan, Egypt. So I would first and foremost put the blame on the Iranian regime and its terror proxy Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. What specifically sparked it? Look, we'll find out as the investigation goes on as to how this was missed. But by all accounts, it seems this has been in the planning for many months, perhaps as long as 2 years. I suspect, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect they saw the protests in Israel, what they thought was a divided society. They saw reservists saying they won't answer the call of duty, which clearly they misread because, as I understand it, the draft has gone 130%, not just 100%, but Israelis have come from all corners of the world, plus the Israelis who were there to defend their homeland, their country. I think the Saudi potential peace deal with Israel, which we all know is extraordinarily complicated, and we weren't at the cusp of it yet, but it was, certainly in the right direction. I think that makes the Iranian regime angry and scared, and all of those together probably prompted them to use this moment in time to launch their brutal, savage attack.
But I mean, some people would argue, isn't it this continuing occupation, as per the United Nations, allegations of intimidation by this right-wing Israeli government that's led to this point? I mean, do you hold Israel's current government, we're not talking about people or the country, but politics, do you hold the current government responsible in any way for this leading up to the intensity that we saw?
No, not only I'll get to the right-wing comments, but not only do I not hold the government responsible for the attack, but I think that anybody who tries to justify this because of what they call the occupation, what I would call a land dispute, anybody who tries to justify it by comments or statements, or even ugly actions by a handful of people who might have attacked Palestinians in the West Bank, I think that they're an enemy of civilization. You cannot condone any person, any group of people, in this case, hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 Hamas terrorists going into another country, or even if they did it within among Palestinians, and slaughtering and murdering and raping and burning civilians alive. There's just no comparison whatsoever. As far as your point about the right-wing comments, look, I disagree with those right-wing comments. There's a lot of things I disagree with coming from a lot of different people. And those comments should be condemned. I wish they would tone down their comments, but those are nothing more than comments. They're ugly comments, it's true, but nothing whatsoever could ever justify this kind of violence.
Do you think that, though, that, and again, obviously I agree, I don't think there's anything that could justify what happened, but don't you think the principle that when a mass of people feel oppressed with no hope, a small percentage or a segment of them might turn to extreme violence that we saw on October 7th? I mean, doesn't it create an environment in which it makes it easy for that to happen?
Well, I'd like to see that mass of people who want better lives first turn on who actually first and foremost oppresses them. It is Hamas, that's in Gaza. I don't think the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah has done much of a job. I mean, when I was in the White House, all they were interested in making political statements. All they were interested is fighting what they view for their rights. They don't improve people's lives. There's a ton of corruption there. They reward Palestinians who murder Israelis with their pay-for-slay program. So I hear what you're saying, the desperation. Desperation doesn't equal murder. And if they're going to speak up and out, then they should speak up and out against their leadership, their terribly divided leadership. And once you have that, you have a society that actually wants a better life and won't tolerate terrorism or extremism, then you could get into proper peace talks.
And obviously, I know you blame Hamas, but is there any, and again, it may be the same question, but is there any blame for Israel? And in terms of people that say that this is all because Israel has been long emboldened, for example, by the position of the American government, for example, supporting them?
I reject it unequivocally. I'm heartened to see President Biden and the Biden administration doing what they're doing. As you know, I was a Trump person, and I've had my criticism about President Biden, in particular, how he approached our Gulf allies, our very, very critical Gulf allies, especially Saudi Arabia, but the United Arab Emirates as well. But on this, he's been very strong. Not only do I not blame him or the administration, I applaud him and the administration.
Is there any blame, for example, like on, or I don't know if blame is the proper word, but when you look at the Trump administration, shouldn't the policies of the Trump administration also be somewhat responsible for the situation we're in? People say it's because Trump administration gave Israel too much and demanded so little from them, from their perspective. How do you respond to that argument?
So I've had that question for years. Let's take Jerusalem as an example, because that's probably the first and foremost question people ask. Why did President Trump recognize Jerusalem? Why didn't he exact a penalty out of Israel? What people don't understand, and again, this is my view, I recognize to your audience this may not be the view they want to hear or like to hear. Jerusalem has always been the capital of the Jewish people. Moreover, under US law, Jerusalem was recognized as the undivided capital of Israel, and it's only President Trump who followed US law. Every other president signed what was called a national security waiver because they felt that that would create some sort of violence. President Trump did not think so. He was following US law. He felt he did the right thing, but people also forget that there was a sentence at the very end of his speech where he said that this does not preclude a peace agreement or something to give Palestinians something to discuss in terms of Jerusalem. And our peace plan actually allocated a part, and yes, it was very, very East Jerusalem, but it also recognized the holiness of what I would call the Temple Mount, and your listeners would call the Haram al-Sharif. It recognized the holiness to Muslims as well. People use these as excuses. They use it as excuses for extremism, for violence, for there not being a peace agreement. I think we never had a chance because President Abbas, for two reasons. President Abbas wouldn't engage on the peace plan. They didn't even look at it. They rejected it before it was launched. And of course, the divided leadership. As much as President Abbas says that the PLO is the sole representative of the Palestinian people, the 2 million people in Gaza are not ruled or represented by President Abbas at the moment.
I know that I attended the Peace for Prosperity conference. I was one of the few Palestinian journalists who went there. I had a hard time getting access to a lot of to Kushner and to the Israeli representatives when I was there. Is there a possibility that they took the Palestinians for granted or assumed that they would just reject this and that they would just move ahead with what they were doing?
Well, I apologize if you didn't get the access you needed. That's a mistake. It should have happened. What happened with that conference, which I think was a very important conference, is that we were trying to show the Palestinians first and foremost, but others as well, how we can help them with the infusion of billions and billions of dollars, not as charity, not as aid, but to create a proper economic plan for them. So if and when there would be peace, there could be a beautiful Palestinian civil society, if you will. The problem is there too, President Abbas boycotted the meeting. He boycotted the conference. He not only encouraged others not to come, he, as I understood it, forbade Palestinians from joining. You're an American, I guess you were able to go. There were some brave Palestinian people who came as well. But for the most part, he was not interested, and they've never been interested in economic conferences, which is a mistake, because at the end of the day, we could argue all day about these core issues. But if there is no economic plan in place, there is no successful Palestinian society. Not today, and not if there ever is a peace agreement.
Now, I noticed that you used the word society, but not state. Was that intentional?
It was intentional. I don't like using the phrase, and thank you for pointing that out, because I think that's important for your listeners. I don't like using the phrase two-state solution, because I think it's it's a couple of short words. It's a phrase that really doesn't get deep enough into the issues. And this brutal attack by Hamas reminds me so much of a very important part that we put into the peace plan. We allowed Israel to be able to do what it needed to do to protect its society, because we know that even one day, God willing, if there is a peace agreement, there will always be elements of society in this region who are terrorists, who want to destroy lives, Palestinian lives, Israeli lives, other Arab lives. And we wanted to make sure that Israel would never have to face this issue. Would it become a state one day? It depends how you define state. I think we came up with a plan that gave the Palestinians the ability to create as successful, perhaps even more successful, a society of Israel. But I didn't want to get into the legal nuances of the word state.
Okay. And just back to this, the current crisis, I guess would be the way to describe it. There's been, we saw this violence on October 7th. Palestinians would say that there was violence leading up to October 7th, and they're worried about what Israel might do currently in response. Is there any justification for what critics say is collective punishment towards Palestinians? Israel says Hamas uses civilians as human shields, but does that justify cutting off water and electricity, for example, to the Gaza Strip and almost all services, food deliveries, everything?
So I think the answer is I don't believe in collective punishment 100%. I don't know the strategy and the tactics of the Israelis. My understanding is that there is sufficient water going into Gaza, that Israel only provides a certain amount of the water. I understand they've since turned it on as well with the encouragement of the Americans. Was it a negotiating tactic? I don't know. I'm not for collective punishment, certainly not when it comes to food, but I don't know how much of this is only on Israel versus also Egypt versus Hamas. There's a lot of reporting on it, and I just can't figure out the truth here.
And obviously, you clearly have an opinion, but can I ask you, do you condemn, for example, the killing of Palestinians, innocent Palestinians, by Israelis? We've heard Israeli military officials call the whole Palestinian population, quote unquote, animals, and that they should be treated as such. How do you look at that? And, have you condemned the killing of Palestinians?
So that statement, and I don't know who said it, I haven't heard it myself, but if you're saying that a minister in the Israeli government said that, I reject that and I condemn that. I do think Hamas and those who support Hamas would fit that description. I do not think that Palestinians largely fit that description. And I think that kind of rhetoric is extraordinarily unhelpful to this. It's what creates the continued divide. As far as deaths of innocent Palestinians in a war, wars are ugly, wars are terrible, but Israel didn't ask for this war. I'm 1,000% supportive of what Israel is doing, as is the US government, as are many governments around the world. Israel has warned Palestinians to get out of the way. They're asking them to get out of the north of Gaza so they could go in and uproot Hamas, which, by the way, not only will be good for Israel, it'll be good for the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. The problem is Hamas is blocking the access routes. Hamas is telling people to stay where they belong, stay in their homes. All of that is going to necessarily result in casualties and deaths of innocent Palestinians, which is tragic. War is a tragedy, but this is not a war that Israel asked for.
Does the devastation in some of the Gaza cities shock you at all, the level of response?
Well, it's sad, but this has been the cycle, right? Hamas builds terror tunnels. They put their headquarters in hospitals, in mosques, within civilian neighborhoods, not because they have nowhere else to put it, but because this is exactly what they do with the human shields. So while I understand the question, the real question has to come before that, which is, how do we end this cycle? How do we end the cycle of Palestinian terrorists murdering Israelis and constantly attacking Israel and causing Palestinian suffering? The only way to do it is once and for all to try to uproot them. Will Israel be successful? I don't know. But we can't keep saying, well, don't destroy this or that, because we'll just let the cycle continue. I think this was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah, so you think if Hamas is uprooted and they're out of the picture, you think that there could actually be a peace process that would move towards a change, a peaceful process? I would say state, and obviously you would have a definition of that state, but is that the critical aspect of this conflict that you think needs to be done?
I think in order to have that sort of good faith negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians, eradicating Hamas is step one. You need to know who the leadership in Gaza is going to be. It has to be a leadership that's interested in building peace with Israel and not a similar leadership to Hamas. But you also need different leadership in Ramallah. Unfortunately, and I know President Abbas well, he and I have many more disagreements than probably you and I don't think he has the capacity, the ability, or the willingness at this point in his life to create a real peace agreement, which means you need new Palestinian leadership over all the Palestinians. And then you could start on that extraordinarily complicated, challenging, rocky road of trying to reach peace.
Any final thoughts at all before we thank you for joining the show?
Look, this is a terrible, terrible, terrible time for humanity. The fact that people could go in and ruthlessly slaughter Jews the way they did brings back horrible memories of pogroms and the Holocaust. I'm not indifferent to Palestinian suffering. I have many Palestinian friends. I recognize that for those Palestinians that do want peace, that do want better lives, they're caught in an extraordinarily tough position. And that's also tragic for them as well.
All right. My guest, Jason Greenblatt, former White House envoy to the Middle East under former President Donald Trump, and the author of the recently published book, In the Path of Abraham, which is available online at www.inthepathofabraham.com. Jason, thank you again for joining the radio show. I appreciate it.
Thank you for hosting me.